My name is Maya, and for 13 years, I believed I was the architect of one of the safest marriages in the world. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't perfect, but it was solid, or so I thought. I believed in the shared bills, the shared jokes, and the shared dreams we built brick by brick. His name was Chris, and I thought I knew the very shape of his soul. I thought I knew the sound of his footsteps on the porch and the rhythm of his breathing while he slept. But I was living inside a carefully constructed, meticulously polished lie. A lie so layered that by the time the truth reached me, my entire identity collapsed. You see, Chris didn't just have an affair. He didn't just live a double life. He had two households. He had a family with another woman that predated mine by nearly a decade. And the part that hollows me out even now, the part that makes my blood run cold, is that while he was telling me we needed to wait to have children, he was already a father of 3 in another city. I wasn't his only wife. I wasn't even his first choice. I was the second act in a tragedy I didn't know I was cast in. Before I show you the evidence that shattered my world, I have to ask, if you found out your 13-year marriage was actually a secondary timeline for a man who had a 22-year head start with someone else, would you disappear in the night, or would you walk into his other life and demand the truth? Type disappear or confront in the comments. This is Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. We're looking behind the wedding photos tonight. Tell me where you're listening from. Do you truly know where your husband is when he says he's working late? The night everything started unraveling didn't feel like a finale. It didn't feel dramatic. There were no storms rattling the window panes, no ominous shadows flickering in the hallway, and no sudden chill in the air to warn me that the foundation of my life was about to turn to dust. It was just an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that usually disappears into the comfortable, repetitive blur of a long marriage. Chris had called around 6:30 p.m., his voice sounding exactly the same as it had for over 4,000 days. Calm, a little weary, and utterly convincing. "Running late, babe. Client dinner. Don't wait up." It was a script he had perfected, delivered with just the right amount of professional exhaustion to earn my sympathy and keep me from asking questions. "Okay," I had said, my voice steady as I stirred a pot of pasta I would end up eating alone. "Drive safe." We had reached that stage of marriage where trust did all the heavy lifting. I didn't need a GPS pin or a photo of the restaurant menu. I believed in him. I believed in the us we had spent 13 years constructing. I spent the evening in the quiet sanctuary of our living room, a space filled with the furniture we had picked out together, the photos of vacations we had taken, and the heavy, settled silence of a home that felt permanent. I remember looking at a photo on the mantle from our 10th anniversary. Chris had his arm around me, that familiar dimple on his left cheek showing as he laughed at something the photographer said. I felt lucky. I felt secure. But at 9:45 p.m., the silence was punctured by a vibration on the coffee table, an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer or a wrong digit, but then it buzzed again and again. Then came the texts that felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. "Do you know who your husband really is?" My stomach didn't just drop. It felt like it had been scooped out with an ice-cold spoon. I typed back, "Who is this?" watching the 3 dots on the screen appear and disappear with an agonizing, taunting rhythm. "I'm not trying to hurt you," the stranger wrote, "but you deserve to know the truth." I stared at the blue light of the screen, the shadows of the room suddenly feeling predatory, as if the walls themselves were closing in to hear the answer. "What truth?" I replied. Then the first photo arrived. It was Chris, but he wasn't in a suit at a client dinner. He was in a kitchen I didn't recognize, wearing an old t-shirt I'd never seen, his arm wrapped around a woman with a tired, gentle smile. In his other arm, he was holding a toddler, a little boy who had Chris's exact eyes and that same inquisitive brow. They looked comfortable. They looked familiar. They looked like a family in the middle of a Tuesday night routine. My chest felt hollow, the oxygen in the room turning to lead as I tried to make sense of the image. I typed, "This isn't funny," but deep down, in the dark place where intuition hides, I already knew. A second photo arrived instantly. Chris was sitting on a navy blue couch, two older children leaning against him, a boy who looked to be about 8 and a girl around 5. Both were his mirrors. Both were leaning into him with the unshakable, easy confidence of children who knew their father was their world. I couldn't breathe. The air in my own house felt like it was being sucked out through the vents. I wrote, "Is this some kind of joke?" The reply came quickly, and it was the final nail in the coffin of my reality. I wish it was. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, the phone glowing in my hand like a live coal. I wanted to call him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand he explain why he was in a stranger's house holding children I had never seen. But a colder, sharper voice in my head, the voice of a woman who had just realized her life was a stage play, told me to wait. I asked the stranger, "Who are you?" The answer didn't just break my heart, it erased the last 13 years of my existence. "My name is Alana. I'm Chris's wife." I let out a sharp, broken laugh that sounded like glass shattering. "That's impossible. I'm his wife." The reply was a death sentence. "We've been married for 22 years. 22. The number echoed in my head like a bell tolling for a funeral. My marriage was 13 years, which meant she was the original. She came first. She was the one who had seen him through his 20s, the one who built the real foundation, while I was just the expansion, the secret addition he constructed 2 hours away. I asked her where she lived. She sent a city name, a place just 2 hours' drive down the highway. 2 hours. That was all the distance he needed to maintain two entirely separate realities. I asked how many kids. 3, ages 8, 5, and 2. I swallowed hard, the bitterness of it coating my tongue like ash. For 13 years, I had asked Chris about starting a family. Every time the subject came up, he had a reason to wait. He would hold my hand, look into my eyes with a sincerity that I now realize was sociopathic, and tell me that he wanted us to have the perfect foundation and financial stability before we brought a child into the mix. I spent 13 years being patient, thinking I was being a supportive partner, while he was already a father of 3 in another zip code. Waiting hadn't been a sacrifice for him, it had been a strategy. He didn't want more children because his life was already full, his bank account already stretched, and his time already partitioned between 2 women who had no idea the other existed. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of water, and walked to the window. The street was empty, the night was still, and somewhere out there, the man I loved was playing daddy in a kitchen that didn't belong to me, while I stood in the hollow shell of a home that was never really mine. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, each one colder and more suffocating than the last. After that initial text, Alana began to send the receipts of a life I had never lived. I sat on my bed, the bed I had shared with Chris for over 4,000 nights, and watched my phone screen light up with the digital ghosts of his other existence. Alana explained that her suspicion hadn't started with a grand intuition, but with a simple, crumpled hotel receipt found in the pocket of a blazer Chris had worn to what he called a regional conference. The receipt was for a boutique hotel only 15 minutes from my front door. It was a careless mistake, the kind made by a man who had grown arrogant in his ability to juggle fire. But that one slip-up had led Alana to do what I had never thought to do: She went diving into his old archived email accounts. There, buried under years of junk mail and work logs, she found a confirmation from a florist located just 3 blocks from our house. It was for a massive arrangement of lilies sent on my last birthday. The note attached was what broke her, and now seeing it on my screen, it broke me. To my beautiful Maya, the woman who makes every year better than the last, 13 years down, forever to go. Alana told me she spent 3 days staring at my name on that screen before she finally typed it into a search engine. She found my social media profiles with the clinical detachment of a woman prepared for the worst. She saw our anniversary trip photos from the mountains, the ones Chris told her were solo hiking retreats to clear his head from the stress of the firm. She saw the photos of us at Christmas, wearing matching sweaters in front of our fireplace during the same week he told her he was stuck in a mandatory corporate audit in the city. She saw 13 years of a life that mirrored her own, yet existed in a total, terrifying vacuum. Every time he was away from her family, he was home with me. Every milestone she celebrated with their 3 children, he was mentally preparing his exit strategy to return to our childless sanctuary. I realized with a sickening clarity that Chris hadn't just been cheating, he had been living 2 complete parallel lives, and Alana had been the one unknowingly funding the emotional overhead of his second marriage. I looked around my bedroom, at the books on the nightstand and the clothes in the closet, and I realized I wasn't a wife. I was a secret. I was the vacation he took from his real life, a 13-year-long intermission in a play that had started long before I ever entered the theater. The most jagged shard of truth was the sight of Chris as a father. As the sun began to bleed through the curtains, Alana sent a photo that felt like it had been designed to hollow me out. It was Chris, younger and glowing with a raw paternal pride, holding a newborn in a hospital room. I recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look he gave me the day we bought our house. But here, it was directed at a life he had helped create. I saw him in another photo, pushing a double stroller through a park I frequently visited, his hands steady and experienced. In our house, the topic of children was a delicate, agonizing dance we had performed for a decade. Chris always had a reason to wait. First it was the mortgage, then it was the promotion he needed, then it was the uncertainty of the world. He would hold my hand, look into my eyes with a sincerity that I now realize was purely clinical, and tell me that he wanted us to have the perfect foundation before we brought a child into the mix. He would say, "Maya, I want to give our kids the life I never had. Let's just get 1 more year of savings under us." I had spent 13 years being patient, thinking I was being a supportive, modern partner by not pressuring him. I didn't realize that the foundation was already built. It just wasn't under my feet. He didn't want children with me because his fatherhood was already a full-time job 2 hours away. He didn't want the financial instability of a 4th child because his paycheck was already being stretched to maintain 2 mortgages, 2 car payments, and the secret life of a man who was playing God with 2 women's biological clocks. I asked Alana for their wedding photos, still searching for some loophole, some desperate way this could all be a misunderstanding. She sent them. Chris in a charcoal suit, 2003. He looked younger, leaner, but his eyes were the same warm, deceptive brown that had convinced me to say "I do" in 2012. He had used the same stories on her that he used on me. He told us both he fell off his bike at 16 to explain the scar on his chin. He told her he was an only child, just as he told me. He had erased his entire past to create 2 separate identities that could never intersect. I sat there as the morning light grew stronger, realizing that for 13 years I had been an unwitting accomplice in the theft of another woman's husband, while he had stolen my chance at motherhood to balance his own double ledger. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I grabbed my keys. I told Alana I was coming to her. I didn't care about the 2-hour drive or the fact that I hadn't slept. I needed to see the car in the driveway and the toys on the lawn. I needed to see the man I loved through the eyes of the woman he had betrayed for 22 years. The drive to the city Alana lived in felt like a descent into another dimension. Every mile of highway I covered felt like I was peeling back a layer of my own skin. I watched the sunrise turn from a pale pink to a harsh, unforgiving gold, illuminating the dashboard of the car Chris had helped me pick out. The car he told me was a gift for being so patient with his long hours. I wondered now if he'd bought it to ease his own conscience or simply to ensure I had a reliable way to stay out of his hair while he was playing house elsewhere. My mind was a chaotic loop of every late night and every business trip from the last decade. I remembered the time he missed my sister's wedding because of a emergency merger, and I wondered now if that was actually the day his second child was born. I remembered the flu he had that kept him away for a week, and I realized he was probably just on a family vacation to Disney World. The betrayal wasn't just in the sex or the hidden family. It was in the thousands of micro-lies that had built the fabric of my daily life. He had turned my reality into a minefield of deception. When I finally pulled onto Alana Street, my heart didn't just drop, it shattered. There, parked in the driveway of a perfectly normal 2-story suburban home, was Chris's SUV. It was the same license plate I had memorized, the same small dent on the rear bumper from when he backed into a pole at the grocery store last month. There was a basketball hoop in the driveway and a stray tricycle overturned on the grass. The sight of it was more violent than any scream. I sat in my car for a long minute, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I looked at the house, a house that looked exactly like the one we had always talked about someday owning. I realized then that I wasn't just the second wife. I was the placeholder. I was the woman he went to when he wanted to feel unburdened by the very life he had created here. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of salt and exhaust, and opened the car door. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew that by the time I walked up that driveway, the man named Chris, the husband I had loved for 13 years, was going to cease to exist. I stood at the edge of that driveway, my legs feeling like they were sinking into the hot asphalt, staring at the front door of a house that felt like a mirror image of every dream I'd ever been promised. The morning air was crisp, but I was sweating, a cold, oily film coating my skin as I walked past a blue tricycle overturned on the grass. Every step toward that door felt like I was walking toward the edge of a cliff, the reality of my 13-year marriage crumbling behind me with every stride. I reached out to knock, my hand trembling so violently that I almost missed the wood. But before my knuckles could graze the surface, the door swung open. Alana didn't look like the villain I had subconsciously tried to cast her as during the long, lonely drive. She looked like me. She had the same hollowed-out expression, the same dark circles under her eyes, and the same trembling hands clutched around a mug of coffee she clearly wasn't drinking. We didn't speak for a long time. We just stared at each other, two women who had been connected by a ghost for over a decade. The silence was heavy, thick with the shared realization that we were both victims of a man who treated our lives like a game of chess. She finally stepped aside, a silent invitation into the inner sanctum of the primary life. The house smelled of cinnamon and laundry detergent, a warm domestic scent that made me feel like an intruder in a way no hotel room ever had. As I walked into the hallway, my eyes were drawn to the walls. They were covered in frames. Chris at a school play, Chris at a graduation, Chris holding a tiny bundled infant in a blue blanket. These weren't just photos. They were receipts of a life lived in full, while I had been surviving on crumbs of overtime and business trips. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean against the wall for support. I whispered, almost to myself, "He told me he grew up as an only child whose parents died in a car wreck." Alana let out a sharp, bitter breath that was half laugh, half sob, her eyes filled with the pity that burned. "He told me he had a younger sister who died of leukemia when he was 10. He told me he was the only one left to carry the family name." We stood there in the foyer, the weight of the house pressing down on us, realizing the sheer, terrifying depth of his craftsmanship. He hadn't just lied about where he was on Tuesday nights. He had dismantled his own history and rebuilt two separate versions of his past to ensure that neither of us would ever go looking for the people who actually knew the truth. He had created two separate men, and we had both fallen in love with a man who didn't exist. Alana led me into the kitchen, a bright, sun-drenched room that felt like the heart of the home, and yet, to me, it felt like a crime scene. We sat across from each other at a heavy oak table, the wood scarred with the marks of children's craft projects and family dinners I had never been invited to. Between us, we laid out our phones like weapons, the screens glowing with the evidence of a 13-year-long heist. For the next several hours, we conducted a cold, clinical audit of a 22-year deception. It was a surgical deconstruction of a marriage. Every business trip Chris had taken to be with me matched perfectly with a family emergency or a late-night inventory he had told her. Every guy's weekend I had encouraged him to take so he could de-stress was actually a family vacation to the beach or the mountains with her and the kids. We compared our calendars with the precision of forensic accountants, tracing the movement of a man who had mastered the physics of being in two places at once. The logistics were staggering. He had perfected a system of color-coded alerts and hidden folders. Alana showed me a second phone she had found hidden in his gym bag, a device I had never seen, despite 13 years of sharing a bed with him. On that phone were the contacts for Work Group B, which I realized with a jolt of horror was actually my life. I was a subdirectory in his digital world. We found separate bank accounts, separate credit cards, and even separate insurance policies. He had built two completely independent financial structures to ensure that a stray paper trail would never cross state lines. But the most devastating discovery wasn't the money. It was the timing. I looked at the date of her youngest child's birth, the 2-year-old. I remembered that week. Chris had told me he had to go to an intensive out-of-town seminar to save his job after a bad quarter. He had called me from the hotel, sounding tired and stressed, telling me how much he missed me and how he couldn't wait to come home to our quiet life. In reality, he was in a delivery room, holding Alana's hand and welcoming a third child into a world I didn't know existed. I sat there, looking at the scratches on her kitchen table, realizing that every "I love you" he had whispered to me was a calculated measure to keep his secrets safe, a tool used to ensure I stayed in my lane while he navigated the high-stakes traffic of his real family. He had stolen my chance at motherhood to balance his own double ledger. The audit didn't stop at the kitchen table. The rot went deeper than either of us wanted to admit. As the morning turned into a sweltering afternoon, Alana's suspicion grew even darker, fueled by a realization that the math still didn't quite add up. She explained that even within her primary life, Chris had pockets of unaccounted time, brief windows where he claimed he was at emergency board meetings or overnight training sessions that didn't align with the time he spent with me. We realized with a shared icy dread that there were gaps. There were missing hours and missing thousands of dollars that neither of us could account for. Alana stood up, her face set in a mask of grim determination, and led me to the garage. Tucked away behind a stack of winter tires and old camping gear was a locked metal cabinet Chris used for work storage. She didn't have the key, but I did. Or rather, I had the spare he kept in his desk at our house, a key I had grabbed in a moment of frantic instincts before I left. When the cabinet swung open, the smell of stale air and old paper rushed out, thick and suffocating. Inside, tucked into the pocket of an old hunting jacket he claimed he only wore for solitary trips, was a third phone. This one was different, a cheap burner, the kind used by people who don't want to be found. It had only 3 contacts saved. One was labeled office, one was labeled transport, and the third was simply a set of initials, SR. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold iron hand. We opened the messages for SR and saw a stream of texts that dated back 5 years. They were shorter, more transactional, but undeniably intimate. Money sent, one read. See you Friday, read another. And then the one that made Alana drop the phone onto the concrete floor. How was the little one's cough? Did the nebulizer help? We stared at the screen as it blinked in the dim garage light. Chris hadn't just lived 2 lives. He hadn't just balanced 2 wives and 3 children. He had a third branch, a 4th child, a woman named Sarah who lived in a different city altogether, a woman who seemingly received regular payments and occasional visits while he was traveling for work. He hadn't been juggling 2 families. He was managing a franchise of deception. We stood in the garage, surrounded by the discarded remnants of his domestic life, realizing that we weren't even the only ones. We were just the largest shareholders in a corporation built on the systematic, emotional destruction of every woman he had ever loved. The man we were waiting for wasn't a husband, he was a ghost, and he was currently on his way home to a dinner that was about to become an execution. The afternoon light in Alana's living room began to shift from a harsh, unforgiving gold to a deep, bruising violet, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. We sat there in a silence so thick it felt physical. 2 women who had been strangers only 12 hours ago, now bound together by a trauma that no one else on this earth could possibly comprehend. We didn't talk much anymore. The audit was done. The evidence was piled on the coffee table like the jagged wreckage of a high-speed collision. The 3 phones, the bank statements, and the photos of children who shared a father's DNA but lived in entirely different realities. Every sound from the street made us both flinch. A car passing by, the distant rhythmic drone of a neighbor's lawnmower, the sharp bark of a dog. It all felt like a countdown to an execution. Alana had told Chris she was making his favorite pot roast, a lure designed to ensure he came home to her tonight, to this house, to the life he considered his primary residence. I sat in a floral armchair that had likely witnessed 20 years of family birthdays and Christmas mornings, feeling like a ghost haunting a house I was never supposed to enter. I kept thinking about the smallness of my life with him in our city. In our house, things were always tidy, always quiet, always focused on us. I realize now that was because I was his rest stop. I was the place he went to escape the beautiful, messy noise of the very family he had built here. As the clock on the mantel ticked, a steady, relentless sound that felt like a hammer against my skull, I started to notice the minute details of his deception. I saw a small nick in the coffee table where a toddler had probably banged a wooden toy. I saw a stray, colorful Lego tucked deep under the edge of the sofa. These were the marks of a real, complicated life. My life with him had been a museum, pristine, controlled, and utterly fraudulent. I felt a surge of rage so hot it made my vision blur at the edges. It wasn't just the other women, it was the stolen time. He had taken 13 years of my youth, my fertility, and my unshakable trust, and he had used them as a vacation from his own responsibilities. He had played a part so perfectly that I never once questioned the script. Alana leapt over at me, her face a mask of cold, pale iron. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, she whispered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "The kids are at my mother's. There are no distractions tonight. It's just us." I nodded, my throat so tight I could barely swallow. We turned off the lamps, leaving the room in a dim, spectral glow, lit only by the streetlights outside. We wanted him to walk into the house thinking it was just another Tuesday. We wanted him to feel the safety of his lie one last time before we tore it out by the roots and left him standing in the dirt. At exactly 6:15 p.m., the sound we had been bracing for finally echoed through the quiet suburban street. It was the low, familiar hum of his SUV pulling into the gravel driveway, a sound I had welcomed with a smile thousands of times before. I felt my heart lurch into my throat, a physical sickness rising in my chest as I heard the engine cut out and the sudden, heavy silence that followed. Then came the sequence of sounds I knew by heart, the soundtrack to my marriage. The heavy thud of the car door, the electronic chirp of the alarm, and the rhythmic, confident stride of a man who believed he was the undisputed master of his universe. I watched through a tiny slit in the heavy curtains as Chris walked up the stone path. He looked exactly the same as he did when he kissed me goodbye this morning, straightening his silk tie, checking his watch with a look of mild preoccupation. His face settled into that relaxed, coming home expression. He used his key, the lock turning with a smooth, metallic click that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. He stepped inside, the scent of the evening air and his expensive, woody cologne trailing behind him like a ghost. "Alana, something smells incredible," he called out, his voice light, cheerful, and devastatingly normal. He tossed his keys onto the foyer table with the same casual flick of the wrist he used at our house. He walked into the living room still looking down on his phone, thumbing through emails, utterly oblivious to the two shadows sitting in the dark, waiting for him. Alana reached over and flicked on the floor lamp. Chris stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't see me at first. He was looking at Alana, a confused, slightly amused smile starting to form on his lips. "Hey, babe, why are the lights off? Did the breakers?" And then his eyes shifted to the corner. He saw me sitting in the floral armchair. The transition on his face was a horror movie in slow motion. The color didn't just drain from his skin, it seemed to evaporate, leaving him gray and waxen. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the floor beneath him had vanished, and he was hanging over a 1,000-foot drop. His jaw dropped, his hands began to tremble so violently he dropped his phone. And for the first time in 13 years, the man who always had a silver-tongued answer was utterly, completely speechless. "Maya?" he finally managed to whisper, the name sounding like a curse he couldn't take back. I stood up, my legs finally steady, fueled by a cold, crystalline fury that had replaced my grief. "Why am I not your first wife, Chris?" I asked, my voice cutting through the air like a razor. The silence that followed was the sound of a 22-year-old empire of glass shattering into a million jagged pieces. Chris didn't explode with rage, and he didn't try to bolt for the door. He didn't even attempt a denial. He simply collapsed into the heavy wooden chair by the entryway, his bones suddenly looking too small for his skin. He looked like a hollowed-out shell, stripped of the charisma and the polished provider persona he had worn like a suit of armor for 2 decades. For the next hour, we sat in that room and listened to the fragments of a soul coming apart in real time. He spoke in half sentences, his voice a dry, pathetic rasp that grated on my nerves. He told us how it started, how he had married Alana young and had quickly grown overwhelmed by the sheer weight of being a father and a provider. He met me years later in a different city, and instead of making the hard choice to leave or stay, he decided he could simply have both. He spoke about the logistics as if he were describing a difficult, high-stakes project at work. He talked about the separate bank accounts, the hidden phones, and the way he had to reprogram his brain every time he crossed the county line, switching personas like a spy returning from a mission. It was clinical. It was cold. There was no mention of the love he supposedly felt for us. There was only the warped pride he felt in his own ability to maintain the deception for so long. As he talked, Alana took the burner phone we had found in the garage and threw it onto his lap. "What about Sarah, Chris? What about the 4th child?" That was the moment his last shred of manufactured composure vanished. He started to sob, not the deep, soul-cleansing tears of a man who was sorry for the infinite pain he had caused, but the pathetic, heaving sobs of a man who was terrified of the consequences. He confessed to a 3rd branch of his life in a city 3 hours in the opposite direction. A woman named Sarah he'd been seeing for 5 years, a child who was barely 4 years old. He hadn't been juggling 2 families. He was managing a franchise of deception, distributing his time, his paycheck, and his lies across a network of women who were all kept in the dark to feed his ego. He looked at us, his eyes red and pleading, and said the most disgusting thing I have ever heard a human being utter. "I just didn't want to hurt anyone. I loved you all so much I couldn't choose." I looked at Alana, and in her eyes I saw the same expression of pure, unadulterated disgust that was burning in my own heart. We weren't his wives, we were his collections. We were the pillars he used to prop up his own sense of importance. And as he sat there begging for one more chance to explain, I realized that the man I had shared a bed with for 13 years never actually existed. He was just a hollow vessel filled with our stolen dreams. And tonight, the vessel was finally empty. The aftermath of that night in Alana's living room wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, methodical demolition of a man's entire existence. I moved into my sister's guest room the very next morning, carrying only 2 suitcases that contained the fragments of a 13-year life. But while I was trying to remember how to breathe, the real work was beginning in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of our respective lawyers. Alana and I did something Chris never saw coming. We stayed in contact. We didn't become best friends. The pain was too sharp for that. But we became allies in a war for the truth. We shared documents, traded bank passwords, and cross-referenced every business expense he had ever claimed. What we discovered was a sprawling, illegal financial nightmare that made the emotional betrayal look simple. Chris hadn't just been balancing 2 lives. He had been running a high-stakes Ponzi scheme with our futures. To fund the status he maintained in all three households, the mortgages, the car payments, the private lessons for his children with Alana, and the luxury gifts he bought to keep me quiet, he had been robbing every account he touched. We discovered second and third mortgages taken out in secret, my own forged signature staring back at me from equity lines of credit I never knew existed. He had a labyrinth of credit cards maxed out to their limits, a hidden web of debt that acted as the scaffolding for his three separate realities. The most devastating discovery came during a cold afternoon in a deposition room. We found out about the staging area. It was a climate-controlled storage unit located halfway between our two cities. Inside, he kept an entire third wardrobe, a set of toys for the child he had with Sarah, and even different sets of wedding rings organized in velvet boxes. He was a man who lived out of a suitcase even when he was home. Every time he transitioned from being Maya's Chris to Alana's Chris, he would stop at that unit to change his watch, his shoes, and even the family photos in his wallet. It was a level of commitment to a lie that bordered on the pathological. But as the accounts were frozen and the houses were put up for sale to cover the massive debts, the master of logistics finally ran out of road. He had spent 22 years building a house of cards, and when Alana and I pulled our support, the entire structure didn't just fall, it vanished into the abyss. He went from a man with 3 families and a high-powered career to a man with 3 active lawsuits and a reputation that was permanently radioactive. It has been 2 long, quiet years since the night the lights went out in Port Alana. And the world looks very different now. My divorce was finalized 18 months ago. A clean, sharp break that left me with my dignity and a deep, permanent wariness of the word safe. I had to rebuild my life from the dirt up, learning how to trust my own eyes again in a world that felt like it was made of smoke. Alana and I still talk occasionally. Our connection is strange and heavy. We are the only 2 people on this earth who truly understand the gravity of the Chris experience. We call each other on the anniversaries of the discovery, a quiet, somber check-in to ensure the other is still standing. Alana stayed in the city, but moved to a much smaller, humbler home. She is rebuilding her life for her 3 children, teaching them that a father's love isn't something that should be measured in business trips or hidden phone logs. She is the strongest woman I have ever known, the first wife who had the courage to reach into the dark and find me. As for Chris, the karma wasn't a sudden bolt of lightning. It was the slow, suffocating weight of total isolation. He lives now in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of a city where no one knows his name. Because of the financial fraud we uncovered, nearly every cent of his wages are garnished for child support, alimony, and legal settlements. He is a man who tried to own everything and ended up with a life that fits inside a single room. He sees his children on a strict, supervised schedule, and from what Alana tells me, they look at him with a confusion that is slowly hardening into a cold, permanent resentment. He tried to contact me 6 months ago, sending a long, rambling email about how he was doing the work in therapy and how he finally understood that I was his true soulmate. I didn't even finish reading it. I didn't delete it either. I simply moved it to a digital folder labeled Evidence and went back to my life. I have learned that my intuition wasn't broken. It was just being shouted down by a man who had spent 2 decades practicing how to sound like the truth. I am no longer the second wife or a hidden chapter in someone else's secret history. I am Maya, a woman who walked through a fire fueled by 13 years of lies and came out the other side with her eyes wide open. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some men are meant to be forgotten. Chris wanted a legacy, but all he left behind was a warning. The truth doesn't just set you free, it burns down everything that wasn't real to begin with, leaving only the ashes of the man who thought he could play God. 13 years, 22 years, 5 years. These weren't just numbers to Chris, they were currency. He spent decades spending our lives like they were his to lose. But here's the thing about double lives. Eventually, the physics of the lie always catch up to you. You can only be in two places at once for so long before the world demands to know where you really stand. I thought I was the only woman. I thought I was building a future with my husband, but I wasn't his first wife. I wasn't his only wife, and I wasn't even his only family. For 13 years, I shared a bed with a man who was going home to another woman and children and a life I knew nothing about. I didn't discover his secret because he confessed. I discovered it because a stranger sent me a message that shattered everything I believed about my marriage. A message that began with, "Do you know who your husband really is?" And what I uncovered next destroyed not just my marriage, but my entire identity. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, heartbroken, or seen, you're not alone. Stories like this happen more than people realize, and every week I share real, raw, emotional stories about betrayal, hidden lives, shattered trust, and powerful comebacks. So if you believe truth deserves a voice, if you believe survivors deserve to be heard, and if you want more stories that expose the darkest secrets people hide, subscribe to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Like this video so more people can find it, share it with someone who needs to hear this today, and comment below, would you have confronted him or disappeared without a word? Your voice matters here. I'm Maya, and I'm finally breathing air that isn't poisoned by a lie. I'll see you in the next shadows.